Thank you very much for that introduction. Before I start, I'm just going to hand out some visual aids, the purpose of which will become clear. So if you could just take some and pass them back, please. So I'm aware that my title is a little strange, but it's drops join to make a stream, ears combine to make a crop. And it's an Indian proverb, and I chose this because I thought it quite nicely summed up what it is that this project is about. But before I go into it too much, I just want to talk a little bit about nitrogen. And for many of you, this will not be new at all, but just in case anybody's not really used to or they don't really know about the role of nitrogen in plant nutrition, it is an essential plant nutrient. It's involved in the manufacture of DNA and protein and chlorophyll. But the fixed nitrogen, which is a form that the plants can use in forms such as nitrate, ammonium, urea, etc., is actually in growth limiting quantities in most natural soils. So as a result, most farmers will add synthetic or organic fertilizers to maximize their yield. Here we have some rice, and you can see why they do this. On the left, no nitrogen. On the right, with nitrogen, much better biomass, much better yield. And for a UK farmer or an American farmer, nitrogen is actually a very substantial part of an arable farmer's budget. So doing these kind of cost analyses, like the ones you see on the left, this works, yeah. The one you can see on the left are very common. If you just rely on the nitrogen that's in the soil, you'll get this sort of area of yield. So you can really see how adding nitrogen can really increase your yield. However, most farmers, because nitrogen is an expensive commodity, they will do trade-offs where they basically try and get to their maximum yield with the minimum amount of nitrogen input. If you continue to increase the nitrogen beyond that, it becomes counterproductive both for your bottom line, and it can also, if you increase it beyond that, you won't get any further yield, and you may even get toxicity if you put way too much on. However, there's a bad side to nitrogen as well, and many of you will also be acutely aware of this. Nitrogen fertilizers are a major cause of pollution, particularly if their application is poorly timed or excessive. They cause leaching and eutrophication, so the process where the fertilizer runs off from fields into watercourses, causes overgrowth of algae and subsequent depletion of oxygen from the water, which leads to things like this with dead fish. It also can increase pest activity if you over-fertilise fields. There are several pest species, including brown planthopper, which really, really like over-fertilised, lush, dark green leaves. And then it gets even worse than that because excess fertiliser that's not taken up by the plants, so that's about 50% of the nitrogen applied is taken up by the plants. The remaining 50% is broken down by soil microbes, leading to these gases, ammonia, methane, nitrous oxide, and PM2.5 particles. This actually is a double contributor to climate change because these gases can cause the climate change, the global warming, but also the Haber-Bosch process that's used to make the synthetic fertilizer accounts for 1% of the global energy consumption. It's a very, very energetically demanding process. And even if you use organic manures, raising livestock, again, has environmental implications. These also, some of these gases, lead to this phenomenon that we call agricultural air pollution. And agricultural air pollution is actually the #1 cause of outdoor air pollution-related fatalities globally. So that's more than industrial, more than cars. It's things like ammonia that are causing the problems. It's dangerous to respiratory health, it's increased mortality. You can probably see from this diagram that there are areas, particularly in India and China, where the area of, where the rate of mortality, where the hot colours are, is really, really high as a result of air pollution. And it may even be a bigger problem than you realise because this is the classic Stephan's planetary boundaries diagram. I'm not sure how well you can see the text, but essentially anything that's within the green zone is considered to be operating within a safe zone for the purposes of the sort of planet's and our human impact on the planet. Anything that's in a yellow zone is in a risk zone, and anything that's in a red is a high risk zone. So this one for biogeochemical flows is nitrogen. You can see it is far, far out in the red. For comparison, climate change is here. So it really is quite a serious problem. So our project is a collaboration with India. Why India? Well, nitrogen is actually really over-applied in India. This is a diagram with data from a paper by Good and Beatty, where they project how much excess nitrogen is placed on fields, and this is in million metric tons. So the blue line is for the USA, and in 2020 it's projected that there'll be 2.9 million metric tons of excess nitrogen applied. This raises to 10.4 million metric tons by 2050. By comparison, this is India. So India projected 2020 6.1 excess metric million tons of nitrogen, raising to 19.9 million metric tons. India are not the worst offenders. Unfortunately, that goes to China, who are really putting on quite a lot of nitrogen. 11.5 million metric tons of excess by 2020 and 41.2 million metric tons if this rate continues by 2050. So why aren't we looking at China? Well, there's a few answers to that. One is that there's already a lot of projects who are looking at China, and two, because India has quite a unique set of circumstances where we feel like we can make a difference. Some of them we cannot make a difference with. An unfortunate one is geography. So this is actually all the air pollution that's crammed up against the Himalayas in northern India. And the reason for that is because in the summer, the prevailing wind comes from the south. It pushes all the air pollution up against the Himalayas. Cold air coming down from the Himalayas keeps it there, and you just get this non-moving blanket of air pollution. And this is a problem that has been increasing since the year 2000. This is to show the depth of aerosol, optical depth. You can see that it really is a big problem, and it really does correlate with the mortality rate. So why exactly do they over-apply nitrogen in India? Why don't they just not over-apply? Well, there's a few sort of drivers for this. One of them is historical. So Indian agricultural policy is highly famine risk averse. So even as recently as the 1970s, India has experienced famine. So their agricultural policy is very much err on the side of caution, put as much fertilizer on as you can, don't take any risks. This is compounded by the fact they have 1.3 billion people to feed. There's also an economic reason. So I said earlier that a farmer in the UK or the US will perform really quite tight calculations about how little nitrogen they can really get away with putting on the field. In India, that economic incentive doesn't exist to the same extent, and the reason for this is something called the nutrient-based subsidy. Nutrient-based subsidy is to do with fertilizer subsidisation. In 2010, the subsidy for other nutrients, so things like phosphorus and potassium, was capped so that the price kind of gave an incentive to not over-apply these. However, due to lobbying by farmers and other groups, urea, which is the main form of nitrogen that's applied in India, was not capped by the subsidy. So urea is really highly subsidised. Some of you might be aware that usually with a fertiliser you'd have a ratio of nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus and potassium of 4 to 2 to 1. In India, because of the subsidy, this ratio is being skewed as high as 38 to 6 to 1, as they seek to basically use lots of the ones that are subsidised and reduce the ones that aren't subsidised, and this is causing quite a few problems. It's causing problems with soil condition and microbial diversity as well. And then finally, there is a cultural aspect to it. There's quite a common belief amongst Indian farmers that greener is always better. And the reason for this is actually quite understandable, because basically there is a very strong correlation between leaves, the depth of the green colour in the leaves and the level of nitrogen that is incorporated. There is also a good correlation between yield and the amount of nitrogen you apply. However, this is a problem because the level of nitrogen and the correlation between the level of nitrogen applied and the greenness of the leaves is quite a linear relationship. With yield, as you saw earlier, it's not, it curves off. So it can be the fact that actually if you're getting very, very dark green leaves, you don't necessarily get the highest yields. I work as a, my work concerns this collaboration, which is called CINTRIN. This stands for the Cambridge India Network for Translational Research in Nitrogen. This is a collaborative project between several UK and Indian-based institutions. In the UK, we have the National Institute of Agricultural Botany. We have the University of Cambridge, including the Sainsbury Laboratory, where I'm based. We have ADAS. And then on the Indian side, we have ICRISAT, based in Hyderabad. We have Punjab Agricultural University. We have the National Institute of Plant Genome Research, based in New Delhi. And we also have an IT firm called Kisan Hub. Kisan is Hindi for farmer, and they develop tools and apps for farmers. We have a lot of different areas that we're trying to help with. I can't talk about all of them today because it's a lot. It's a very big project. But part of it is to look for things like genes that might increase nitrogen use efficiency. Some of it's to do with fertilizer uptake strategy. Some of it's to do with translation into crops, agronomy tools, and tools to empower farmers to make better sort of decisions about nitrogen and fertilizer application to their fields. So I'll talk firstly a little bit about the breeding side of it. So the idea is that we might be able to breed crops that can basically use nitrogen more efficiently, that don't need so much fertilizer. And some of the ways we can do this is looking at certain nitrogen responsive traits. There's various nitrogen responsive traits. You can look at things, for example, like tillering. So that's shoot branching. For those who aren't aware, these are tillers. So you can reduce tillering, you can lower your canopy N requirement, so basically have a sort of cheaper plant that doesn't need as much nitrogen essentially. You can increase the roots going downwards, because that's a good strategy to forage for nitrogen, with less sort of surface rooting, because that's more of a sort of phosphorus foraging strategy in roots. So there's various things you can do. Now, unfortunately, I'm not allowed yet to tell you about our genes, but hopefully all will be revealed quite soon. We've used a few different species. I work on this part of the project mostly, which is the Brachypodium distachium part of the project, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But we also use these two types of millet, which is foxtail millet, which is a C4 grass, and pearl millet, which is C3. And the reason why we use the millets is because they're already a staple part of the Indian diet, and they're also considered to be a sort of climate change ready crop. They are very hardy, very drought tolerant. They can germinate in temperatures of 60 degrees or more. So they are very sort of good and well placed for any sort of climate change that's occurring in India. We use these to screen for any kind of natural biological nitrogen use efficiency traits, with the hope that we will find sensitive and insensitive accessions, so that we can find the genes that are controlling this sensitivity. One of the reasons why I use Brachypodium is because it's a model grass, so it's easy to work with, but because it's never been domesticated, it doesn't have the genetic bottleneck that a lot of things like wheat have, because a lot of wheat varieties are selected on high nitrogen, so they're not really the place to go hunting for genes involved in nitrogen efficiency. I did a QTL screen on some of these Brachypodium. My colleague in India is also doing ones on millet. And as you can see, one of the nitrogen responsive traits that we got a good peak for was tillering. We can see that basically I chose two accessions that I thought one was sensitive to nitrogen and one was less sensitive. The blue one is the less sensitive one, the pink one is the more sensitive accession. Made a cross between these, recombinant, and made recombinant inbred lines, about 145 progeny that were inbred for 7 generations. And this is showing the tiller number on high nitrogen, that's the orange line, and low nitrogen, which is the green line. As you can see, when you add nitrogen, the tiller number goes up. There's no question about that. But you can see that some ones respond much more vigorously than others. You can see that the mother, the maternal line, really drastic response to nitrogen, whereas the father sort of a more muted response. So from this, we did a QTL scan, and we found that there is indeed a peak associated with this tillering response to nitrogen on chromosome 5, so we're investigating that further. And then there's also my colleague, Matt Milner from NIAB, who has expressed, he's overexpressing a mystery gene at the moment, but one of the things that he noticed that when he overexpresses this mystery gene is that you can change the plant's perception of N status. So usually when a plant is low, it's grown on low nitrogen, it increases the expression of nitrogen transporters, which makes sense. By overexpressing this sort of unrelated mystery gene, he found that it actually means that the plant is on low nitrogen. It doesn't increase its expression of nitrogen transporters, so it's almost like the plant doesn't kind of care that it's on low nitrogen. Interestingly, no loss of yield. So that's a paper that's, I think it's been submitted now, so hopefully soon you can read all about that and I can drop the secrecy, but yes. Now the second thing is something I'm going to talk a bit more about because it's this one's probably been the most successful part of the project so far, and hopefully now you all have had a chance to play with this thing. What this thing is a leaf colour chart, and it's not actually a completely novel invention, but it has been optimised, I would say, for Indian crops by this guy, who is Virendra Singh from the Punjab Agricultural University. And he wanted a simple tool that farmers can use in their field, because many of us might be familiar with spad meters, where you can sort of clamp onto a plant and measure the sort of amount of greenness in a plant and use that as a proxy for how much nitrogen it's sort of taking up. Spad meters can cost about £1,000, which is pretty much the average wage of an Indian smallholder farmer yearly. So this is not really an option for them. We wanted something that was basically like a cheap spad meter, where we could give recommendations as to whether they needed to add more nitrogen or whether to scale it back. So this is the tool that was developed. It's very cheap, it's 100 rupees, which is about £1. And we can hand this out to farmers, and I don't know if any of you looked, when you turn over the chart, it has tailored recommendations about what to do with your nitrogen depending on basically what happens. So all you need to do is line the leaf up, check what the number it aligns to, turn it over, and you'll get your recommendation. This was trialled in a Punjab village called Basian. We had to sort of convince the farmers that they would not lose any yield if they followed our directions. So that was a bit of a leap of faith for them. Luckily they did believe us, and it was a good job that they did, because they reported an average saving of about 75 kilograms of urea per acre, which is up to a 50% reduction on what was being applied before, and crucially, no loss of yield. They also had a reported reduction in pestilence because their fields weren't over-fertilised, and things like the brown planthopper were less interested in eating these nice green leaves. So some of you who were at the new phytologist meeting in Nancy might remember that we were sort of asked this question, which is, how can scientists in high-income countries help with the challenges of low-income countries? So in my very sort of humble opinion, as a result of doing this project, my advice would be talk to the local stakeholders and find out what it is they really want. Don't just kind of go in there with, it's obvious. Talk to them, find out why they haven't done what seems to be obvious in the first place. Talk to other disciplines. I never really had much of an involvement with social science before this project, and it's actually been really helpful to kind of broaden my understanding. So understand it is a two-way conversation. If you think that this is an Indian problem, you are completely wrong. This is everybody's problem. This is something that was published in The Guardian a couple of months ago. UK government failing to tackle rise of serious air pollutant. The serious air pollutant is ammonia from agriculture. Meanwhile, last month, the Indian government are considering to fix the nutrient-based subsidy rate for urea. So they might finally put some caps on urea to encourage more responsible use. So we learn from each other. I'm just going to very quickly talk about future directions, because the CINTRIN project the funding has now come to an end, so we're wrapping this up. We have a sister project called Tigress, which is continuing to address the issues in Indian agriculture, but this time with increased social science involvement. They're looking at policy outputs, they're looking at changing demographics. A lot of men are leaving the farming profession in India. It's not seen as glamorous. They're moving to the cities to pursue jobs in things like IT. So we're getting an increasing number of female and youth farmers. So we want to look at how we can empower these farmers, and looking at whether the crop selection is the best for the sort of various climates throughout the subcontinent of India. And then, as for me, I now work with Gatsby Plant Science Education Programme, which a lot of you will have heard of. This is to do with the engagement of young people in the UK with plant science. We, just a very, very quick plug, we have a MOOC, a free MOOC that your students may be interested in, improving food production with agricultural technology and plant biotechnology. That's on Future Learn. Talk to me if you're interested about it. And I just want to thank a lot of people, the entire CINTRIN network, particularly to thank our Bandia Pad Haye, who is my work package partner. That's him when he came to visit NIAB. Ottilie and Liza's lab in the SLCU, where I was based. Devon O'Connor, who helped me with a lot of the Brachypodium stuff. Shalaja Fennell and Wan He of the Centre of Development Studies for really kind of giving me the social science aspect of things. Tigress and all of our funders. Thank you. And if you're interested in following me or any of our projects, there's some Twitter handles. Thank you.